Before that, simple framework. Firstly, what does the status quo look like? Somaliland operates as a self-declared independent region in the northern part of Somalia. Crucially, Somaliland has fulfilled preconditions of a sovereign state. 1. The government under the rule of Musa Abdi has permanent residence in all 7 regions of Somaliland. 2. Bank of Somaliland established the Somaliland shilling for their own currency. 3. They have their own consulate and 30 representative offices in 4 continents for visas and passports. Crucially, lastly, I want to note that Somaliland is the most democratic region within the Eastern Africa. We see this by their Global Democracy Index, HDI, and the stability of the Gini coefficient, and they have kept their peaceful stance for decades. What we want to crucially push here is the idea that principally, Somaliland has a fundamental right to be a sovereign state. No, thank you, for the simple fact that it follows an international framework for what constitutes sovereignty and what sovereignty like a state ought to fulfill. We think ethically, it deserves a right to self-determination for the same purposes that any other independent state does, and this point is debate-winning insofar as this principle in and of itself is practically incontingent within this debate. Insofar as we prove to you why sovereignty ought to be protected, African countries cannot and should not infringe. Therefore, I heavily encourage their next speaker to engage with this principle. No, thank you. Secondly, what does the recognition of sovereignty of Somaliland look like? This presumably looks like African countries acknowledging Somaliland distinct from Somalia. This looks like Somaliland joining the African Union. This looks like Somaliland joining the regional member countries. We think that recognition won't happen overnight, i.e., AU peace support organizations will step in to prevent the potential conflict seen in previous success cases on things like South Sudan's independence in 2011 and Mali's insurgencies in 2012. We'll take that in a bit. So we believe being accepted into AU leads to 2 things. Firstly, Western powers like the US and EU will also recognize Somaliland. I know opposition will contest this. Let me be clear. There are 3 reasons why Western countries will also recognize this. Firstly, AU is a significant voting bloc in multinational institutions that the US respects and recognizes as the legitimacy of. Therefore, the US cannot weed out one specific country, frame this as illegitimate, insofar as that would also be equal to delegitimizing the AU as an institution in the first place. But secondly, they have a strategic incentive to be a white trade partner with Somaliland due to its resources in oil and gemstones. But 3, I want to note that similar situation happened in Catalonia in the EU. It gained international legitimacy precisely because it entered the EU in the first place. Before I move on, sure.
You said in your framing that somehow the African Union will minimize and stop a possible war conflict between Somalia and Somaliland, but they weren't successful in doing so with Eritrea and Ethiopia and Sudan and South Sudan. Then how are they going to stop that?
So the first thing I want to point out is, I think your premise that the conflict is likely to happen is unlikely. I'll prove that later in my second argument why the stability is ensured uniquely on our side of the house. But secondly, I provided you a reason as to why there's likely to be success cases in those of South Sudan and those of things like Mali insurgency in 2012. The second thing I want to point out is that I think Somalia's primary interest rests in domestic terrorism control rather than keeping its statehood within Somaliland. There are 2 reasons for this. Firstly, currently, Somaliland suffers from the most dire humanitarian crisis in the 21st century. With the majority of Somali militia focused on combating al-Shabaab, it is unlikely for Somalia to have the capacity to put effort in delegitimizing Somaliland, especially when its top investors like the US is making a conditionality when aiding them, saying that those money ought to be used only in the instances where you're fighting with these kind of al-Shabaab projects. But secondly, if Somalia truly cared about absolute statehood, they wouldn't have allowed Somaliland to have a representative office in places like Ethiopia or in places like Turkey, and they have already done this. Therefore, Somalia doesn't have an overriding incentive to keep Somaliland within its territory. First argument as to why we significantly better the economy of Somaliland. The first thing I want to prove under this argument is to say why why not recognizing its country is likely to connect to the degradation of the economy. 2 reasons why. Firstly, you're unable to join the international organizations that are vital for your local economy and your country's economy. This is because international organization literally tells you to have legal requirements of things like sovereignty, and you don't have it. But secondly, even if Somalia gets aid through international organizations, they're unlikely to share it with Somaliland simply because the vast majority of the population lives in Somalia, and there's this rising political tension between these two countries. But the second thing I wanted to point out is a comparative on why the economy is better on our side of the house. There are two reasons why. Firstly, the international recognition allows Somaliland to receive aid from the intergovernmental institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. Somaliland will now have access to the friendly global market through institutions like the WTO, and Somaliland will now be able to ask for loans to the World Bank and IMF that have a significant amount of funds that is incomparable to those of NPOs and NGOs. But secondly, Somaliland now gets to join the African Cooperative, like the African Investment Bank. This is incredibly important, as joining the African Cooperative as how many African nations developed in the status quo. The AU fosters the economy of nations in Africa through various mechanisms, such as reduced trade barriers, infrastructural development in Africa, and big nations like South Africa, Nigeria, and Rwanda can all be big investors. The conclusion of this argument is simple. You get a better economy on our side of the house. There are two large impacts of this. Firstly, a better economy means more stability for people on the ground. When Somalia becomes richer, Somaliland can now invest into buildings such as hospitals and infrastructural projects. No, thank you. But secondly, this also benefits the economy of Somalia. This is because when Somaliland becomes richer, the economical benefits are likely to trickle down to the surrounding countries, especially Somalia, because currently the economy of the two nations is interconnected with each other due to proximity. That is why when one nation gets richer, it is likely that the economical benefits are going to trickle down. We benefit both. Second argument as to why we create stability between Somalia and Somaliland. There are two reasons why stability between those two nations, two regions, increases on our side of the house. Firstly, but before that, sure.
Especially if economic potential and infrastructure potential is the metric as to why a country should be sovereign. It shouldn't, for example, Tokyo just be its own, because if they got IMF and also World Bank to fund them, they'll probably be much better off alone.
Okay, so the first thing I want to point out is I think this all is contingent on individuals living in that region wanting to become a sovereign state in the first place. But secondly, in order to be principally consistent, we are more than happy to also allow this in other regions for this principle. The first thing I want to point out under this argument is that bar of having conflict within Somaliland becomes extremely higher on our side of the house. This is because one, insofar as you're now going to be a sovereign state, attacking them would be seen as an invasion. This would be two things. One, having conflicts with Somaliland would result in economic sanctions by the AU, as they really care about respecting borders. This is incredibly detrimental for Somalia, given that they're facing a crisis and they don't have a strong economy like Russia. Secondly, even if they still go in, we can subdue the conflict. The African Union mission in Somalia has international troops situated there, alongside emergency backup forces like African standby forces, which means that we can neutralize the forces in times of the conflict. The second reason why this is unlikely is because it is likely that the US will back Somaliland for two reasons. One, Somaliland is located in an extremely strategic place in the Horn of Africa, which is a choke point of the Gulf of Aden, which means that the West has an active incentive to secure that place siding with Somaliland. Secondly, currently there's a growing Chinese influence in the Horn of Africa, and the US has an active incentive to counter that influence. So all of those prove why invading Somaliland means making the US enemy. Hence, on an economic and diplomatic level, it is unlikely that Somalia has a capacity and incentive to want to have conflict within that region. For all those reasons, Team Japan.
Hi. Just checking that all the judges are ready. Okay. My time starts in 3, 2, 1. Proposition wanted to talk about the standards of sovereignty, so let's talk about what that really is. Fighting for sovereignty in Africa looks like the torture and maiming of innocent civilians by Ambazonian militant groups in Cameroon just based on the suspect that you are against the secessionist movement. It looks like tens of thousands of people being displaced in the Central African Republic due to rebel groups taking over villages. It looks like 60 years of violence in Sudan. The standard of sovereignty is much more than determination. It's about principled international law that has been respected for specific reason. Territorial integrity is tangible integrity, so proud to oppose. 3 parts in my speech. Firstly, on framing. Secondly, proving in my first argument why Somaliland does not meet the criteria for being recognized as an independent state. And thirdly, second argument, proving why the recognition of Somaliland perpetuates instability on the African continent. Firstly, then, on framing, 2 parts here. One, firstly, on context. Since even before the establishment of the African Union in 2002, since the establishment of the previous Organization of National Unity in 1963, the persisting mission of the African continent has been that of maintaining existing colonial borders, or the principle of uti possidetis. Note that this is extremely crucial, as territorial integrity was not an effort pushed by colonial influences, but an independent one, that preserving the structure post-independence for the African continent would be the most logical and practical way to prevent damage to territorial integrity. Hence, secessionist movements have only led to independence under extremely specific and, more importantly, dire circumstances, such as outright civil war that had absolutely no alternative. Any argument in appeal to sovereignty or self-determination must come with the understanding that there are, in the modern era, no principles of self-determination that can be realistically upheld without the threatening of another's, and proposition's burden is to prove why it's okay to weigh one over the other. This is secessionism, masked under communal efforts. They must defend that. Second, what is our stance then? African countries should not recognize the sovereignty of Somaliland. We would not treat them as an independent nation, but instead see them as a part of Somalia. However, because the most important metric for sovereignty is not internal variables, but instead external ones, on the condition that Somaliland meets the 2 criteria for sovereign recognition, that A, the agreement of the previous sovereign, in this case Somalia, and B, for the process of recognition to be formally overseen by an international body, that is the only case in which we'd be okay with recognition of sovereignty. But in instances of states granted recognition in the past that proposition may bring up, like Eritrea or South Sudan, it has always included the consent of the nation it was seceding from, and it was also overseen by international bodies like the United Nations. That is why it is vastly inefficient to claim sovereign recognition on the basis of stability, democracy, or the vague principle of self-determination that are all inherently internal issues. Therefore, 2 metrics in today's debate. Who proves what the metric for sovereignty is, and who best protects the people on the ground. Before moving on to anything, I'll move on to a couple quick rebuttals. One, I just want to quickly rebut their premise that the African Union will just step in and intervene if any conflict happens. Where was the African Union? If this is correct, then where was the African Union when Eritrea and Ethiopia were fighting over territorial disputes because of Eritrea's secession 5 years ago? A war of 2 decades happened. Lives were lost. They didn't do anything. They need to actually give us structural reasons as to why the African Union would waste so much resources and step in. But the rest of my rebuttals will be integrated throughout my case. Firstly, then, on my argument on how Somaliland does not meet the criteria for being recognized as an independent state. Why is this true? I'll be addressing the 2 criteria here. One, in terms of the criteria of the consent of the parent state. We want to tell you that Somalia and Somaliland's borders are still militarized. This engages with their challenge that conflict will not happen. How all peace talks that have been happening with the help of Ethiopia, Djibouti, and other Western and African nations is under the condition that Somaliland is not recognized as an independent state and that they are currently not perceived as a threat. Technical issues such as international aid, airspace management, and security cooperation that are fundamental for peace facilitation only operate when upholding international law and judicial principles. If the rest of Africa recognized Somaliland's sovereignty without Somalia's recognition, this would, by principle, be an infringement of international law principles such as uti possidetis or respect for colonial era borders that most, especially powerful Western states, cannot abide by. For example, the UK, US, and France have all declared that they will only recognize Somaliland if the African Union recognizes it first. They do not want to be embroiled in interstate conflict, and the trade can still happen even without recognition, so that point on their side also falls. But when Somalia loses its land to Somaliland here, there's a high likelihood of war, or at the minimum, unsanctioned cross-border conflicts like we've seen in Eritrea and Ethiopia. But second criteria here, for the recognition to be overseen by an international body. Every other nation that has successfully seceded has been through a formal process. For example, Eritrea had a UN supervised referendum. or South Sudan had an internationally monitored peace agreement. However, Somaliland has not been through any. But why is abiding by these precedents important? Because breaking the principle for international law means that most, if not all, bodies who operate under it lose capacity to facilitate peace or maintain structural integrity in the region. This is especially significant in the context of Africa, because Africa, unlike other continents, has a major problem with the rise of separatism due to national identity crises and a complex political history after decolonization. Many governments were left behind corrupt and unstable due to hastily built political systems, or many borders were drawn by colonizers and failed to recognize many of the ethnic or religious divides. Africa has the most dictators and authoritarian leaders in power, has the most ethnic conflicts, and has the most secessionist groups compared to any other continent by very large margins. This means that any amount of conflict is now exponentially more devastating to the region, which is why Africa's struggle to keep political stability is a well-known issue that has to be put first over any problem. Their mechanism about how the African Union cares a lot about borders is exactly why we cannot violate Somalia's borders. Second argument then on how the recognition of Somaliland perpetuates instability on the African continent. The premise of this argument is that when we don't abide by the African Union's commitment to respecting colonial borders, a lot of instability is caused. The impact of this argument is that territorial integrity isn't about colonial institutions enforcing their principles onto the African continent, but the mission of the African Union and its member states' incentives to self-preservation. Why is this true? Because one, secessionist movements are going to be far more prevalent on their side. If Somaliland, no thank you, is now seen as an exception to the principle of uti possidetis because they are non-unique in meeting the criteria for independence, now every secessionist movement thinks that they qualify for the recognition of their sovereignty. But before moving on, sure, I'll take that POI.
Somaliland is already de facto independent except for its recognition. I don't understand the incentive of secessionist movements seeing this as a success case insofar as nothing changes on a de facto level.
No, the fact that on your side you're going to recognize Somaliland when they have not met these other criteria, that means that they are non-unique from every other secessionist group existent in the status quo. That is exactly why there's going to be more secessionist movements on your side. Much like how the Ogaden National Liberation Front in Ethiopia cites the successful secession of Eritrea as their inspiration. On their side, more secessionist movements are likely to pop up, and existing secessionist movements are likely to become more hardline and violent if they believe that these methods are likely to work. For example, the Ambazonia Defense Forces, who are engaged in a civil war with Camerooni security forces over secession, or the Mombasa Republican Council in Kenya, who are also engaged in heavy conflict. The comparative on our side is that we do not give hope to these movements, and we deter secessionist movements from thinking that an established region equates to immediate recognition of sovereignty. What are we willing to trade off? Why are we willing to trade off any principle for this? Because maintaining territorial integrity comes above all, because instability means that people on the ground who have nothing to do with the conflict experience devastating consequences. Instability means that any economic benefits that might accrue are undermined by factories being destroyed, guns being bought because of continued warfare. It means that those who are oppressed not only don't get access to essential goods, but are now actively pushed away from free elections, and now they're going to be oppressed once again in this new state. It means that those who don't have anything to do with the conflict can no longer live without field. Secession is dirty, and opposition is the only one that protects those on the ground within the bounds of real politics. Territorial integrity is tangible integrity. So proud to oppose.
Can I have a few moments to set up my notes? If I speak at this volume, can everyone hear me? I'd like to talk about three things in my speech. Firstly, do we polarize secessionist states? Secondly, will this result in conflict in the greater Gulf region? And thirdly, my extension on principle. But before that, I want to note a few major clarifications that ruins and devastate side opposition's case. Firstly, we want to propose a frame which is mitigatory between the conflict in Somalia and Somaliland. We think that African nations would try to prevent polarization and conflict by hiring mediators and negotiators on our side of the house. This is likely to happen because African nations likely know that if they just blatantly recognize independence, conflict is likely to happen. This goes against the incentives of African nations because conflicts just destabilize Africa, as they say on their side of the house. This looks like a refugee crisis occurring, more spillover into nearby countries like Ethiopia. The implication of this argument is that the AU is likely to invest into things like negotiators and etc. on their side of the house because they have active incentive to do so. That is a structural reason that we gave on our side, which they never engaged to in their first speaker. But the second thing I just want to note is that the majority of their principal argument was contingent on the fact that no formal body will be recognizing Somaliland sovereignty on their side of the house. I think the AU recognizing Somalia's sovereignty is a formal body recognizing Somalia's sovereignty on our side. No. I don't understand why that principle of sovereignty then is violated on our side of the house. I just want to go further with this point, because on their side of the house, the reason why all these nations like South Sudan and etc. got independence, got consent from their nation is because of the fact that they did things like violent overthrows and stuff like that. On our side, we don't do that. We impose a peaceful method in which secession can happen, which we think is highly, highly beneficial because you don't polarize secessionist states. Which moves me on to my first point on why you don't polarize secessionist states on their side of the house, which probably means that we win this debate because this was their second major argument. So the premise of their point on secessionist states is that secessionist states are going to find similarities with Somaliland, which in turn incentivizes them to cause conflict. As we pointed out in our POI, this is unlikely because the characterization of secessionist states is that they probably are inherently violent. This is because in order for their message to get across, they need to opt into things like terrorism because they don't have a voice. Considering that the transition in Somaliland is likely to be peaceful, no nations will see this as a violent overthrow, right? In fact, this is where we flip their argument on why secessionist states are likely to become more peaceful. Now, because if we do take their analysis that movements are likely to see Somaliland secession as so influential, we think that secessionist states will realize that to achieve independence, they need to become more peaceful, more democratic, and more stable. This is more probable for their mechanism on why secessionist states are likely to copy Somaliland's progression into independence. The implication of this argument is that secessionist states, in the absolute best case, on their side of the house, are likely to become more peaceful on our side, which means that we quaff all the benefits that they gave in their first speaker. But the second thing I want to point out is that even if we do take their absolute best case, this is likely to be symmetric because precedents already exist on both sides of the house, right? For example, we pointed out how South Sudan's violent secession, which resulted in a humanitarian crisis, still happened on both sides of the house, which I don't understand why this is a unique tipping point for these secessionist states to actively rebel against their host nation. Before I move on, I'll take that POI.
You say the African Union, for the sake of stability, and they try to negotiate and mediate these things. Isn't it just better to not indeed negotiate with the idea of sovereignty at the first place, like how they're doing, so that they don't have to waste resources and aren't able to respond to just like Eritrea?
Yeah, but the thing is, you say that, but you don't engage to all the analysis that came from our first about you get massive economic benefits within Somaliland. So at the point in which you do provide there's a net benefit for African nations, then you can't argue that there's no benefit on our side of the house. You have to prove analytically why that's untrue in your second speaker. With that being said, I'd like to move on to my second point on will this result in conflict within the greater Gulf region. And I think the major response that came from side opposition in this speech is that our principles
are bad and like should not be taken because of the fact that this will result in greater instability in the Gulf region, which is bad for everyone involved. But we gave two major strategic mechanisms on why this is unlikely in first, which they never engaged to in first speaker. Number one, we said that a lot of these individuals want enemy relations to Somaliland to have access to the Gulf of Aden, and ultimately, we think this is a major debate-winning incentive because obviously the West probably will want access to Gulf of Aden on both sides of the house, which means that they have a massive incentive to stabilize the region. And notice that this stands in contingent of their rebuttal on how the AU doesn't have structural reasons to actually invest into Somaliland. Because at the point in which we do prove that West developed nations like America, developed nations like the UK have an active incentive in order to stabilize this region, we think that this separation of states is likely to be successful. Wait, sorry. Before we move on, can I stop the timer? My timer stopped working. Sorry. Right. The second thing that we pointed out in our first speaker is that you don't want to destabilize the region because that would empower bad actors like Al-Shabaab to gain control in that region and do things cause famines that kill tens of thousands of individuals. And we think that this is debate winning because we prove here that Somaliland is not incentivized to fight with Somaliland on their side of the house. And this is for two major reasons. Number one, conflict between Somalia and Somaliland is unlikely to occur because the current president, which is Hassan Mohammed, main political agenda is peaceful integration of territory, and his political party is literally called the Peace and Development Party. That means that if he does actively pursue conflict, he and his party will lose face on the international sphere. But secondly, even in the status quo, Somalia is fighting Al-Shabaab. Considering that Somalia has limited resources and resources are zero-sum, Somalia isn't likely to go to war with Somaliland because they already engaged in conflict. Here's why the above analysis is more incentivizing and therefore Somalia is unlikely to go to war with Somaliland. We think that the voter base in Somalia cares more about Al-Shabaab compared to Somaliland, especially considering that Somaliland's ethnic majority is different from Somaliland's ethnic majority. What that means is that people in Somalia are unlikely to care relative to what Al-Shabaab did, which was cause famines that killed tens of thousands of their Somalian kin. But the second thing I want to note is that conflict is fundamentally unlikely to happen on their side of the house because of the fact that conflict is inherently expensive. Notice that in the status quo, 7.8 million people are starving, and about 50% of the population of Somalia need humanitarian assistance to actually survive. What that means is that Somalia is unlikely to risk their voter base, or the president of Somalia is unlikely to risk their voter base at the point in which most of it is most of them are probably already starving in the first place. With that being said, I'd like to move on to my extension on principle. The thesis of this argument is that Somaliland fulfills all criteria laid out by the international community as to what types of communities are justified to be recognized as a nation. And we gave a lot of framing and first as to why this is the case. Firstly, the government under the rule of Musi Abdi has permanent residence in all 7 regions of Somaliland. But secondly, the Bank of Somaliland established the Somaliland shilling for its own currency. But thirdly, they also have consulates and 30 representative offices in 4 continents, right? At the point in which we prove that that Somaliland is like independent nation, I think we can prove that they have the right to claim over sovereignty. And notice that their major mechanism here was that, it doesn't relate to countries like West Sudan and etc. But obviously it doesn't relate to countries like West Sudan and etc. because of the fact that Somaliland is so independent in the status quo, they deserve this right of sovereignty. Now, opposition cannot simply brush off this principle. There's a couple of reasons as to why this argument is really important. Number one, borders are inherently ambiguous and subjective and thus have no tangible way to objectively prove whether they should exist in certain areas. Therefore, the underlying premise that justifies the existence of currently recognized nations like Korea and Japan is people actively buying into the fact that these criteria being crossed legitimizes the existence of each nation. For all these reasons, we're so proud to propose.
Okay. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. The other side sounds a lot like the same people that use the white man's burden as a way of expanding their land. Oh, the economic benefits, and the country's too weak, so I guess it doesn't matter, right? When America and a bunch of like other European countries are allowed to just go into Africa, completely destabilize their political state, completely take away all their oil and gold with the justification of, oh, we know how to use it better. Also, oh, these African countries are too weak anyways, just like Somalia, so we'll take over because there will be only little conflict and they won't be able to respond anyways. That's exactly their two arguments, right? First one is about the idea of economic benefits, then second they go into about how Somalia is too weak, even if they're angry, they can't do anything. Those are not good enough examples and reasons as to why a country should be sovereign, and that's the reason why they're not winning on anything in today's debate. Sovereignty is more than just the idea of internal values and for economic development, and the parenthood nation is too poor and too weak to indeed engage upon anything. It's more about the idea of external values such as stability and also recognition of the parenthood nation. Also, what does the rest of the communities think? Because in the end, because there's such limited land, you need to always think about, can self-determination also conflict with another country's self-determination? That's the reason why self-determination is an outdated idea that can't be used as the only metric as to how a country should be recognized. For those reasons, territorial integrity is tangible integrity, more than proud to oppose. Mainly three things actually I'm going to do in my speech. First, I'll talk about the potential for conflict, then go into the economic benefits that they're going to talk about, but it's going to be not messy, I'll try my best, but because my third argument is basically talking about why economic benefits are actually worse under their side, and why government conflicts will be worse under their side, I'll just kind of take the econ part out of the argument, put it in my rebuttals and also some of the weighing, and then also focus more on the government stuff in the third argument. So let's first talk about the potential conflict that they're talking about. I think there are three levels to this. First, let's establish what the premise of what really happened was, because I'll to give you a little bit of a history lesson. Somalia and Somaliland was broken up by Italy and Britain. Italy was the one that basically took over Somaliland, and Somalia was taken over by Britain. When Italy lost World War II, they had to pull out, and Britain was the one that took over all of those regions. And that's the final border that we're currently using. Once indeed Britain also left, after the post-colonialism over during the times of 1950s to 60s, what happened was Somaliland decided to join Somalia by a referendum and also agreeing to the idea of being a part of their constitution and everything. Then in the 1990s, they suddenly changed their mind and say, oh, we want independence. But the problem is that because they agreed from the first place that they wanted to be a part of Somalia, I think that's the reason why, due to reasons of post-colonial borders, us trying to keep that, but also previous agreements, that's the reason why they can't just be like, oh, I suddenly want my own land. But making that premise clear, then let's go into more of the analysis, right? Second, about can Somalia fight? But I think this is a horrible argument. Even countries like Eritrea, which is just as worse as, for example, Somalia, which is called also the North Korea of Africa, can also pull out a military and indeed fight against Ethiopia, continue to send mercenary groups to indeed fight these Ethiopian military groups. I don't see why Somalia can't do it, because even Somalia's own forces can do this. Also, for example, Somalia is supported by Qatar and Turkey, especially with the heavy investment in their president's military, right? So for those reasons, I don't see why suddenly they can't attack, and this is a horrible premise that they're trying to run. Their whole argument is basically saying that, oh, because it'll be a peaceful process, we encourage other secessionist groups to also be peaceful. But the wrong thing about that is the premise. Already it's very militarized, the borders as well, and already there are plenty of military that are ready to engage at any time, and that's the reason why they can't just say it'll be a peaceful operation. And for those reasons, Somalia definitely can fight. But then let's also talk about the African Union. I think when it comes to African Union, they just say that, oh, they have the incentive to make it stable, and that's the reason why they'll somehow make them negotiate and do stuff. That's as if like African Union hasn't been trying to negotiate the interests of, for example, Somaliland and Somalia. They've already been trying to have peace talk efforts, not on the idea of sovereignty, but other aspects as well, such as on an institutional level, also when it comes to funds and investments of each countries. I don't understand why suddenly the African Union should have the incentive to recognize the sovereignty of Somaliland when they've already been trying to have peace talks amongst them with the idea of trying to unify them or make them work separately while still not recognizing the sovereignty of Somaliland. I think for those reasons, on the incentives of African Union, I don't get why they would also have the capacity to actually help these people. They aren't able to help a lot of the countries currently that are unstable due to secessionist groups, and also when it comes to such as Eritrea and South Sudan, I don't see why they suddenly have the capacity to indeed make sure that Somalia and Somaliland wouldn't get into conflict. I definitely think they will have conflict. Let's move on to then about the economic benefits, because their whole premise relies on, sure, even as in his PR response he said, right, because the economic benefits still exist, that's the reason why we win. I think basically if I break that, then they're completely out of this debate. So when it comes to economic benefits, benefits. Many reasons why it'll be worse under their side. First of all, the reason why they have those economic benefits is because investments only come when they don't treat you as a competitor. The reason why, for example, Ethiopia and Djibouti and these kind of places continue to invest in these areas and also use the ports, for example, located in Somaliland, is because they don't see them as competitors. It's usually more as an affinity thing. We think that for those reasons, obviously people are less likely to invest in your country when you're recognized as a country and you're actively in the AU and also you're in the IMF and the World Bank as you continue to become a competitor. But second of all, the government instability is much worse under their side, and due to military conflict, it will heavily affect the economy, just like what happened in Eritrea and also Ethiopia, right? Even before then they had certain stable governments and whatnot, but once they led to conflicts, that's the reason why indeed their economy was much worse, right? We also told you as to how there can be proxy wars, basically, or conflicts within those countries, such as the idea of UAE and Saudi Arabia heavily supporting Somaliland, while Qatar and Turkey heavily supporting Somalia, right? What happened, especially when it comes to Gulf state conflicts, is them also instigating things such as the Yemen civil war. I don't exactly understand why they wouldn't do exactly the same when there are also plenty of resources that they can use in these areas, and also the geographical location of Somaliland and Somalia are very beneficial for trade. I think for those reasons, also due to reasons of proxy, and also due to reasons of them and Somalia also obviously going to be angry that the chunk of their own land is gone, and they can easily get military backup from countries such as UAE, the Qatar and Turkey. I think that's the reason as to why this idea of conflict will continue to exist, and economic benefits they guarantee will not happen once the government is unstable. So for those reasons, I think this idea of economic benefits does not exist, because even then, they never really fully make out why suddenly getting investments from World Bank and IMF will suddenly lead to miracles, such as the idea of country completely developing, when their hook was about how people are starving. So for those reasons, I think this economic benefits doesn't go anywhere. It's a wash at best. Now let's do the weighing as to what's more important in today's round. Because I tell you what's more important is the idea of the external values that we bring to you, but tying it back to what the incentives of the African Union is. Because what's contingent upon is the African Union indeed recognizing Somaliland at the end of the day, and that's the only way that other even Western countries or countries outside of Africa will recognize them. The reason why the African Union doesn't want to do this, because they have been doing this for a long time, right? The whole idea and the reason why they were established since the 1960s and then the new branding of the African Union in the early 2000s is because they wanted to keep the post-colonial borders, because that's the only kind of border that can really keep. And this directly engages with their 22nd extension on the idea that the borders currently are not really fair. Well, then what other way are we supposed to do, right? The reason why we keep this is because we can't come up with a better border, and because the other side doesn't come up with a better mechanism as to how we should set these borders for ethnic minorities and certain secessionist groups. That's the reason as to why we need to keep this and try to adjust to this for the sake of stability, because we continue to tell you stability continues to exist, and secessionist groups such as the idea of Ogaden, like the liberation movement, and for example Ethiopia, were able to be encouraged by Eritrea and South Sudan to continue their violent actions. Then let's move on to a little bit about why government instability is much worse under their side. Because even on the internal values, they lose out. When it comes to government, the reason why they're actually stable right now is because of the unity of clans under the idea of sovereignty being gone, right? Sovereignty being there, right? What we tell you is once you indeed gain sovereignty, political instability is much worse under their side, because even we tell you the most recent election in Somaliland was not stable. It also had corruption, but the only reason why they're able to keep up the idea of stability inside the government democracy is because they have one goal of trying to gain sovereignty. We would rather have that continue and have that country unify under that goal and not try to let them achieve it, because that just leads to further instability, and that's just the reality of real politics. So for those reasons, we think that when it comes to government instability and the economy, it gets much worse under their side, but because they never met out why these suddenly funds from other countries are going to help them, I think that's the reason why they totally lose out. But even then, we weighed out to why the external values are more important, more than proud to oppose.
Can I be heard if I talk at this volume? Okay. Essentially, their biggest practical argument coming from their side is that now Somalia would have active incentive to go into conflict. But the tiny little mechanism that comes to support this point comes from their Prop 2 when they say that Somalia will now be mad because a part of their nation wants independence. We think that this is just assertive in nature, and I'm going to prove to you mechanistically why that's not true in my third clash. But with that, I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, on the principle, secondly, on economy, and then thirdly, I'm going to talk about conflicts. Firstly, on the principle then, and I think there's this big characterization and debate on what the international law actually looks like. Because the premise, essentially, for both of their arguments coming from their side of the house, is that because there's like an insurance that nations that they succeed from have to agree for them to be recognized as independent, insofar as we violate that, there's more rise to things like insurgency groups. So their practical point also relies on this principle assertion as well. I have three responses to prove why this is unlikely. First, this is just inherently not true factually, right? Countries like South Sudan, in that instance, like Sudan did not consent into it, and the mechanism as to why our characterization about things like international policies being more catered towards things like recognizing sovereignty if there's actual self-governance and not being as strict as like saying that nations that they succeed from have to recognize is because of the simple mechanism that succession is unlikely to be a peaceful process to begin with. This is because oftentimes there's very little incentive for like the nation that they're succeeding from to agree with it completely. Therefore, insofar as the AU and the international community its main incentive is to maintain peace within the region, they're far more likely to opt into our metric to what the sovereignty actually is principally founded upon. I'll take you in a second. But secondly, even if we agree that agreement for Somalia is the principal priority to them being recognized as a nation, there's two reasons why Somalia would actually agree, even if that's hard. First, because the net loss of, because there's financial net loss that's coming every year from aiding Somaliland, but B, and more importantly, there's external pressure from Somaliland that's increasing in the status quo. The thing is, this mechanism comes here on two folds. A, if they reject Somaliland, the currently peaceful operation that Somaliland is doing in order for it to gain independence might turn more violent over the long term when they know that there's no other alternatives. But B, Somaliland is currently rising in terms of GDP. They're increasing incrementally, like 6% of increase every year. Therefore, it's very likely that they'll get net more economic power in the long term, so they will want to have bargaining power in the short term when they're not as powerful. But third, even if we concede to all of that, there's a huge tension in their case, because in O1's analysis, they say that if the African Union recognizes it, then the international institution would also recognize it. We think that number one, that's a huge tension with their case, but secondly, African Union is likely to recognize the sovereignty, insofar as this motion explicitly states that African nations would recognize. With that, I'm going to move on to the second theme of economic benefits. But before that, is there any POI?
So it was justified for the British colonizers to take over the lands of Native Americans because they provided much more economic benefits, and also the Native Americans are much weaker, so there wasn't much of a potential conflict.
I don't know what that historical example does to this debate, insofar as I prove to mechanistically why international institutions are likely to opt into our framework for a principle more than their framework for their principle. With that, I'm going to talk about the economic benefits. I'm going to talk more about the utilitarian metrics here. So on economic benefits. So their response to most of our arguments was essentially twofold. Firstly, that investors don't find any incentive to invest into Somaliland. This is just untrue to begin with. This is because 6% of GDP increase is happening annually because of the Gulf of Aden that Somaliland has access to, that's controlling most of the trade between the Middle East and other Western nations in the status quo. But secondly, there's also things like natural resources there. And the thing here is, these MNCs of Western nations want to invest in Somalia. That's the characterization that we gave to. But they're unable to do this in the status quo because there's no protection given to them insofar as there's no things like embassies and stuff. Therefore, we think that investors are far more likely to invest on our side of the house that flips their characterization. Secondly, their next engagement is to say instability. Two things. Firstly, this is unlikely, and I'm going to prove to you later in my speech why that's unlikely. But secondly, even if we assume our absolute worst case and concede to everything, sure, there might be instability and investors might not find the incentive. What was actual argument from our side of the house? What we told you that even if all of the responses fly, our argument was simple. Just by the nature that the African Union will now recognize Somaliland's sovereignty, and by the nature that international unions will likely be prone to recognizing their independence that they do not contest with, it's far more likely that they get access to things like, for example, free trade agreements, like the African free trade agreements that the members of the AU nation get access to. Moreover, things like investing from the World Bank and stuff. The thing here is, many nations have the active incentive to invest into these nations, like Nigeria and Territorial, but right now they just can't because there's no embassy in the status quo. But moreover, like development funds that are like the World Bank that are crucial for investing in the economy to kickstart development in Somaliland is inaccessible on their side of the house insofar as you don't recognize its sovereignty. We told you that this is a detrimental impact that gives us the win in this debate. This is because of two things. Firstly, on that probability of impacts, right? Instability is improbable insofar as going into conflicts is extremely high cost. Therefore, we think that asking for things like funding from the development fund and getting that funding to kickstart infrastructural development is the more probable impact in this debate. But secondly, these people are extremely vulnerable. They are literally suffering in the status quo because not a lot of nations want to trade with them because of lack of embassies and stuff. Therefore, it's very likely that insofar as they get that net more money, even if that net more money is unlikely to be that big, we think that we weigh over them significantly because these people are extremely vulnerable. Let's finally then talk about instability. No, thank you. And I think there's two subclasses under this. First on secessionist movement, and then secondly on conflicts between Somalia and Somaliland. Firstly then, on secessionist movements. I have two responses to this. Firstly, regardless of Somaliland, secessionist groups will likely act in violent, radical ways. And we gave you two reasons as to why that's true. A, because they feel that in order to have vocal power to begin with, they need to act in violent ways. We gave you this mechanism from Ochi, they do not contest with this. But B, we told you that given their characterization, that these movements will likely look into precedents to formulate their ways of behavior. It's just empirically true that the norm in most instances is insurgency groups acting in violent ways. We saw this in example in countries like Ethiopia, Sudan. Therefore, the issue with their argument is that they never proved the tipping point for why now the secessionist movement will act in violent ways on our side of the house. Now, but even if they were able to prove that, the reason why our flip actually stands is because of that. This is to say, insofar as they agree that this new secessionist movement will now be the tipping point for all of this other secessionist movement, then they concede to the fact that they'll mimic the ways that our insurgency group worked. And the crucial characterization that we gave you from first is that they're peaceful in nature. Therefore, we think that that's a positive impact in and of itself. Therefore, we flip their point on secessionist movements. Finally, then, let's talk about conflicts between Somalia and Somaliland. Now, our claim is simple. Two things. Firstly, in terms of incentive, they have more incentive to not go into conflict. This is because Somalia's primary interest, as we provided all the way from first, is domestic control, right? We gave you this from second. Their only engagement to this is that they have the capacity to want to go into conflicts, so they'll do so. And here's where I engage on the second field, on capacity. But my first field already tackles with whether they have capacity or not. They just don't have the incentive to go into conflicts, but they just don't have the capacity. Because we gave you two characterizations that came uncontested with from first. We told you that A, there's massive infrastructural loss in Somaliland if you go into conflict with them, meaning that in short term, there's net less benefits for Somalia, and therefore there's you need to incur loss of economic cost of rebuilding, even if you're able to integrate Somaliland into your nation. But B, there's a high likelihood of AU sanctioning Somalia at the moment in which it's a nation-to-nation invasion, which means that there's incremental damage. And the thing here is, we don't really need to prove that AU has invaded these countries before, or AU has acted in what ways or whatnot. It's just written in the AU law that if it's a nation-to-nation invasion, then they have to sanction. Therefore, the economic cost is just too high, so in terms of capacity, they're unlikely to invade. For those reasons, we're incredibly proud to stand on proposition.
Start. Okay. 3, 2, 1. At the top of this speech, I want to call out Japan's shamefully under-mechanized and under-analyzed principle on recognition. Would Japan still hide behind the ambiguous field of ethnicity when that means hundreds of citizens in Nigeria lose their lives due to proxy conflict? Would Japan still stand proud next to their principal foundation of banks when that means thousands of children in Mombasa have to worry about whether their parents will come back home safely? Their own language that embarrassingly hints to the fact that they don't know the difference or understand the difference between a nation and a state proves just how shallow their principal argumentation was in this round. Korea uniquely recognized that the right to self-determination is never absolute and that territorial integrity is tangible integrity opposed. I'm going to chat about two things in this speech. Firstly, on the criteria of recognition, and then secondly, on politics and economics. Firstly then, does Somaliland meet the criteria for being recognized as an independent state? Here I want to do mainly two things. Firstly, respond to their principle of the right to self-determinism, and second, bring back our own case on the actual metric for the recognition of sovereignty. Firstly, on their argument of the right to self-determination. The actual case that Japan gave to us in the round does not actually have that much analysis. It's very shallow. It's the fact that, oh, the country has a bank and their own currency. Oh, the country has their own ethnic, specific ethnic exclusivity. These are metrics that are met in various countries, even within Africa, but we don't recognize them as a state, even though we recognize them as their own collective group, as a nation. No, thank you. So that never met the bar. And here are two pieces of normative framing that just proves to you why their shallow argumentation weighs less than the metric that we give to you in this round. Because this right is an inherently ambiguous concept, that it is never absolute. Because in this circumstance, what we uniquely pointed out is more important than this right is uti possidetis, given the Organization of National Unity in 1963 that promised the maintaining of existing colonial borders to ensure the stability of independent states whose borders were vastly drawn arbitrarily. So sure, even if we concede them and take them at their best, those metrics might work for a specific scenario, but what we pointed out is that in the circumstance of Africa, given this Organization of National Unity, and given the purpose of the African Union, what is more important is the metric that we posit on borders. But B, even if this right exists and is principally important, given that the motion is talking about, again, African countries, we ought to understand precisely the obligation of the African Union that outweighs this independent right to self-determination, which is that they have the obligation to maintain stability, to achieve a better life for the people of Africa. That may exist for Somaliland, but that means risking the smiles of other countries and people within other countries. But second, just on their principle in and of itself, here are two inherent principle responses. A, that it is principally unjust that African countries recognize Somaliland when Somalia, the previous sovereign, has not agreed to or consented. Because associative rights do not override agreement, given that we would not justify presumptive economic benefits to Somaliland as a proxy for Somalia's consent. But B, even if the principle is contingent on pragmatic outcomes, they massively increase stability, which is far worse for the people that they said we had an obligation to. Our case on the principle was very simple. It posited to you that there are two more important standards that work for the cases of their own examples of Eritrea and South Sudan. Firstly, on the agreement of the previous sovereign. This is highly important because we've proven to you why it is unjust that African countries, not necessarily Somalia, choose the destiny of Somalia and Somaliland. Because in the circumstance specifically of Africa, their shallow response in Prop 3, which is far too little and far too late, is that Somalia is likely to concede to this or consent to this. Firstly, that is massively untrue. That's just empirically untrue. Because in the status quo, peaceful negotiations exist on our side, but those negotiations don't reach a point in which Somalia has actively consented to the sovereignty of Somaliland. But B, even if it is likely, pointing to the potentiality of something is never enough of a justification for that country's consent. But B, the process of recognition needs to be overseen by an international body. Their response is that the AU recognizing sovereignty is a formal body. This misses the mark of the argument. Our argument was that an international body ought to oversee that recognition and the process of recognition on our side. But second, no thank you, even if African countries recognize this, and this is highly vague as to how this will happen on their side, countries like the UK and US do not intervene prerequisitely on their side. So even if that happens as a reactive measure, as a slippery slope argument on their side as the end implication, that was not the point of the argument. It was that prerequisite to that recognition that must be overseen by an international body. So at the end of theme 1, what we've proven to you as the implications are twofold. I'll take it after this. A, that their normative claim on the principal right to self-determinism does not actually have analysis. And B, what is more compelling then is our argumentation on the circumstance of Africa on the precise criteria of recognition. This already wins us the round. These independent from geopolitical and economic impacts, given their own weighing in first proposition speaker, we posit that this is highly unjust. But if I move on to theme 2 about politics and economics, I'll take the point.
So if the African Union recognizes the sovereignty of these nations, by the nature that they have huge voting blocs internationally and economic capacity, it's very likely that the international union would oversee the agreement.
first, we've already proven to you why that's not likely in propensity, especially given the incentives of the US and UK not to intervene in these proxy conflicts between Somalia and Somaliland. But B, that again misses the point of the argument. Sure, that might happen after that recognition of sovereignty, but what we've proven to you is that during that recognition of sovereignty, during that process of recognition, it is important that we have an international actor that is still vague even after third proposition. Theme 2 then, on how will the recognition of Somalia's sovereignty impact the politics and economics of the African region. I just want to first bring back our argument on how this perpetuates massive instability. Our premise was that independent secessionist movements alongside Somalia are likely to view recognition as possible, and this leads to massive conflict. That this creates territorial dispute and conflict also between Somalia and Somaliland. We pointed to examples such as the Niger Delta Avengers or the Mombasa Republican Council that doesn't get coherent response from their side. The end implication of this argument was that citizens of the most rampant states in Eastern Africa become the nails that get hammered down by the steel mallet of political greed, and we thought that was practically something we cannot accept on Team Korea. Their response is threefold. Firstly, that African nations are likely to have mediators and negotiations. The first thing to point out is that retrospectively, there has been thousands of conflict in this region, and this is not true. And even after third proposition, it is still unclear to me who these mediators and negotiators actually look like. But second, that these mediators and negotiators always do not work. They don't prove to your propensity. That's why just if you hire someone to negotiate conflict, that will actually work on their side. But thirdly, even if this works, this is inherently reactive on their side, so the harm in the conflict has already been done. In their point about then, the independent secessionist movements are likely not to have the incentive, and even if they have the incentive, are likely to be peaceful. This is just a lie. Because the point that we've proven to you is that this is a tipping point, or a comparatively likely tipping point, given that these independent secessionist movements are comparatively likely to see the potentiality of independence, especially given that Somalia doesn't meet the criteria that we already pointed out to you down our bench, and that they're likely to be violent, given that they want this type of power immediately. At the end, our argument on ethnic division was never responded to, that what unifies this region and these clans are specifically the power and promise of sovereignty, but as soon as they're sovereign, there will be conflict and fighting for sovereignty. In conclusion, Japan uses the blood caused by regional conflict to lubricate the gears of self-determination, to wash their hands from the supposed moral sin of economic degradation, and we thought that was criminally unjust. Proud to stand on opposition.
Cool, we thank Total. Maybe you know oversight.
Okay. Let's start. Start in 3, 2, 1. Sure, even in their best case, even if they peacefully somehow make it so that Somaliland just has their own land, Somalia has their own, that doesn't mean that they're not encouraging secessionist groups to also continue violence. But what we tell you is, even if you peacefully walk into a poor country, take over their land, and then start setting a government, an independent economy, and just now say that that's your land, that's basically medieval times Europe. We don't understand why suddenly you peacefully go into a country and saying it's your land on a peaceful matter, and then setting your own government and economy is suddenly still justified. Even if it didn't include violence, that doesn't mean it's suddenly justified, and that idea of just savagely taking over someone else's land at the end of the day doesn't mean it's still justified. And that's the reason why even if they prove the idea of peace or whatever, it still means that there will be conflicts at the end of the day, because now the message is as long as a country is poor enough, then they can't respond to a bigger force, then they're completely screwed. That's not what the African Union is supposed to guarantee. What they actually guarantee is the idea of keeping up borders, so that even if certain ethnic minorities are harmed, even if smaller countries are harmed, we still keep the border at the end of the day.
Mainly two things I'm going to do in my speech. First, what are the metrics that should be used? Then going into the idea of even then, let's use the internal values that they're talking about and talk about why that still wouldn't work. Then first out the idea of what are the metrics that should be used. Mainly two things I want to cover. First, what exactly are the incentives of the AU? We tell you that they aren't there for the reason why they don't support the idea of Somaliland becoming their own country is because of the idea of stability. Even if they continue to prove that there are some economic benefits, there are some benefits of governmental stability, that means on the other side of Africa, there's also instability, such as in Nigeria's Boko Haram, and also them continuously attacking, because now that becomes a justification for why they're able to change the post-colonial borders. We need to, for those reasons, at the end of the day, we don't see why indeed the African Union will agree to even recognize Somaliland when there aren't really tangible impacts. But they keep saying, what if the AU does recognize? The problem is that AU will only recognize if Somalia recognizes that came from the framing of our speech. We told you, as long as Somalia consents to the idea of Somaliland becoming independent, then we're totally down for Somaliland to be their own thing. But the problem is, because that's not going to happen, and because there is a very good reason as to why Somalia can't just let Somaliland leave, because they agreed to be a part of their constitution, they agreed to be their own people, that's the reason as to why African Union would not consent, because at the end, it's reliant on the consent of Somalia, and that's the reason why they're completely out of this debate if their whole idea is that somehow African Union agree without the idea of thinking the consent of Somalia. And for those reasons, on the basis of what these African Union fights for, it makes no sense for them to say that African Union would be under their side. But then second, about the idea of economic benefits doesn't how it doesn't matter. Because we told you on a principle but also practical level as to why it's not going to work, such as the flipping of government instability and political conflicts and proxies amongst the Gulf wars, leading to the idea of government becoming more unstable and also economy being worse, because the only reason why people invest is because they feel affinity for Somaliland, and also they don't consider them as competitors. If that's the case, I don't exactly understand why. I don't exactly understand why economic benefits is so important on their side. Because even under their own metrics of internal values and factors that are somehow supposed to dictate if a country should be sovereign or not, does not go in the favor of their side. If the government becomes more unstable, if the economy becomes worse under their side once they gain sovereignty, I think then obviously on the basis of eternal values, they're also out of this debate. Because not only did we tell you on an external level why that's more important than internal values that we told you, such as then even if a country or even if a region has all the economic potential, all the government potential, it still doesn't matter, because then you're also violating another person's self-determination, because you're also violating another person's ability to indeed grow and have economic development and also government development. All of their internal values rely on the external values that we're talking about. Because self-determination is zero-sum game due to limited land, this means that you're also curving the internal factors of other countries, such as the economic development and government development, that they also have potential to indeed grow by you leaving. Such as I asked them at POI, can Tokyo really be their own country? If that's the case, obviously it leads to further government instability, as I told you. But also, if you indeed say no, then also it leads to them having a situation where it goes against their own principle. That's the reason as to why they don't have a clear principle, nor the internal values that they're talking about makes sense and is completely outweighed. More than proud to oppose.
If I speak at this volume, am I fine? Three classes in this debate. Firstly on economy, secondly on internal conflict, and lastly on secessionist movement. But before that, let me just delete their claim on principle of territorial integrity. I have two major responses. Firstly, principally, our metric for a country's recognition for sovereignty is more likely to be true. This is because the bulk of which the AU and international law is found on is maintaining peace. This is the mechanism by which we maintain peace. Therefore, we don't think that nations agreeing to secession is going to be the criteria insofar as that's likely to lead more conflict to actively convince your nation to let you go. But secondly, completely, their entire principle was contingent on Somalia not wanting to let this nation go. That is why on our argument later in my classes, I'll prove to you why the Somalia's incentive shifts on our side of the house. Firstly, let's talk about economy. What did we tell you? We told you two unique benefits from side propositions per speaker. Firstly, we told you that they're likely to be able to seek for help on intergovernmental aid such as the World Bank and IMF. No responses. Secondly, we told you as to why you can join the AU uniquely on our side of the house. You unlock development projects, you unlock reduced trade barriers, you unlock investments from big African nations. There is literally no response against that, right? What is the weighing here? Two pieces of weighing. Firstly, probability, which they give no responses to, but secondly, on vulnerability. This literally, right now, this country is the 11th poorest region in the world. That is why, I know this is counterintuitive, Judge, but take this, especially if other parts of the debate were iffy, which I'll make it iffy. Second class then, on the internal conflict. All of their argument was premised upon Somalia continuing to have incentive to keep Somaliland under the statehood. Firstly, they tried to get away with no mechanisms. Debate reverse analysis, not intuition. They literally give no mechanisms as to why Somalia would want to continue Somaliland in the statehood. Secondly, we gave you counter reasons as to why this is unlikely to be the case from first speaker. What was that? First, invading Somaliland will be seen as an invasion on our side of the house. And note, the West will literally support Somaliland insofar as there's strategic incentives to want to secure the Gulf of Aden. No response. Secondly, sure, Somalia wants to maintain Somaliland right now, but they don't want to continue because they also get things like, I don't know, like economical benefit that trickle down on our side of the house, right? So if the Somalia's, Somalia's economy was the thing that they wanted to push, I think that it's going to be better on our side of the house. That is why the calculus changes. But lastly, even if they have the best incentive to want to maintain its sovereignty or maintain its statehood, I just want to know that they don't have the capacity insofar as they have things like dire humanitarian crisis. They have things like conditionality aid that they need to use their money towards things like fighting against Al-Shabaab. That is why even if they might have those kind of incentives, that is not the overriding incentive. That is the thing that they miss in this debate. But even if all of these are not true, already Narkami told you as to why the conflict is likely to be worsened on our side of the house, which they also decided not to engage. Finally, let's talk about secessionist movement, right? Two responses we gave you. Firstly, it's unclear why secessionist movement will see this as a successful case. Because literally, when you look at the secessionist movement is a movement where you're within a region, where you're within a region where the region have more control over you, right? And you want to go against that region, and you want to go outside of these control. But within these specific instances, this is about international recognition. You're already de facto independent state. But secondly, if they see this as a success case, this is actually a good thing, right? We've been telling you from first. What is that? Because Somaliland is the most peaceful and democratic nation. Secessionist movement, as per their own language, if they understand that they can gain sovereignty in this way, that means that you're more likely to take this negotiation or take this kind of peaceful instances, peaceful ways as a way in which you get these kind of sovereignty. What does this mean? You're more likely to take a peaceful method on an entire scale on the African continent. What they say under way mechanism is to say, this is literally African continent is big and you ought not care only about Somaliland, right? But we flip this and tell you, if that was the case, we actually do it better on our side of the house. Because we told you from OGs first, OGs teach that this violence is likely to be symmetric, but on our side it has a uniquely overturned incentive that in order to get the sovereignty, you actually have to use the peaceful methods. That is why we flipped your analysis. For all those reasons, it's clear win from Team Japan.
We thank both teams for the debate. Please cross shake hands.
Thank you for the debate.
Thank you for the debate.